Remember when we could trust the New York Times? Neither do I. That pompous trash rag is barely fit to line your birdcage, let alone to be your window to the world. Like most journalists for dying newspapers, the writers and editors for the New York Times view themselves as morally superior to the rest of us, not to mention smarter than us and wiser than us. Not surprisingly, they believe that it's their mission in life to manipulate us into accepting their moral and political views. One writer and editor for the New York Times finally had enough, and she submitted an epic letter of resignation. Let's read some of the parting thoughts of Bari Weiss. Twitter is not on the masthead of the New York Times, but Twitter has become its ultimate editor. As the ethics and mores of that platform have become those of the paper itself has increasingly become a kind of performance space. Stories are chosen and told in a way to satisfy the narrowest of audiences, rather than to allow a curious public to read about the world and then draw their own conclusions. I was always taught that journalists were charged with writing the first rough draft of history. Now, history itself is one more ephemeral thing molded to fit the needs of a predetermined narrative. So, before the editors of the New York Times decide to publish a story, their main question is, what are people going to say about this on Twitter? One of the most respected newspapers in the history of the world has been reduced to a puppet of Twitter mobs. Here's the irony. The professional snobs at the New York Times have dedicated their lives to manipulating the little people, when in reality, these snobs are spineless morons who serve as the intellectual foot soldiers of the alliance of perpetual toddlers we call Twitter. Cowards have no business lecturing anyone on anything. Weiss goes on to describe how she was openly persecuted for being a centrist at the New York Times. Traditionally, we have people on the right, people on the left, and people somewhere in the middle. But in recent years, the left went so far left that the people in the middle now seem like far-right extremists by comparison. Part of me wishes I could say that my experience was unique, but the truth is that intellectual curiosity, let alone risk-taking, is now a liability at the Times. Why edit something challenging to our readers or write something bold only to go through the numbing process of making it ideologically kosher when we can assure ourselves of job security and clicks by publishing our 4,000th op-ed arguing that Donald Trump is a unique danger to the country and the world? And so self-censorship has become the norm. What rules that remain at the Times are applied with extreme selectivity. If a person's ideology is in keeping with the new orthodoxy, they and their work remain unscrutinized. Everyone else lives in fear of the digital thunderdome. Online venom is excused so long as it is directed at the proper targets. Since journalists need to make a living from their trade, we can imagine what kind of pressure the new orthodoxy and the new Inquisition put on young writers and editors. All this bodes ill, especially for independent-minded young writers and editors paying close attention to what they'll have to do to advance in their careers. Rule 1, speak your mind at your own peril. Rule 2, never risk commissioning a story that goes against the narrative. Rule 3, never believe an editor or publisher who urges you to go against the grain. Eventually, the publisher will cave to the mob, the editor will get fired or reassigned, and you'll be hung out to dry. That's the New York Times, according to a writer and editor who couldn't take it anymore. Traditional journalism is dying because people just don't trust the media anymore. Companies like the New York Times know that their business is dying, so they start flailing around like a drowning victim trying to latch on to something that will help them stay afloat. These geniuses decided to cling to Twitter mobs, thinking that this will bolster their popularity, not realizing that by becoming the puppets of Twitter mobs, they're destroying their credibility even more, thus hastening their own demise. What's most disturbing here, however, is that the New York Times is not alone. Virtually all of the major news outlets have become the ministries of propaganda for their favorite outrage mobs. And it's not just news outlets. The biggest companies in the world are now bending over so far backwards to appease the mob, you'd think they were in a global limbo competition. These companies, however, control social media. They can order Facebook and YouTube and Twitter what to do because they can withhold ad money if the social media platforms don't obey them. So we are witnessing before our eyes a small group of social media personalities who have no real power or influence apart from their fan base, forcing the entire world to its knees. I hope you're taking notes because this is one of the most epic power grabs in history. As for the New York Times, another willing victim of this power shift, I can tell the editors exactly how to escape the clutches of an outrage mob. Let me address them directly here. Writers and editors for the New York Times, if you want to avoid being forever remembered as the generation of journalists who were so stupid and so cowardly that you destroyed your own company and your own trade, all you need to do is go down to the basement of the New York Times building and find some old filing cabinets, the ones covered in dust and cobwebs because they haven't been opened in decades. Find the old filing cabinets and go to the cabinet marked T. Open the cabinet and skim through the files until you locate 2 testicles.